former candidate for the U.S. Senate, longtime radio talk show host, author, and conservative policy advocate.
Justices to the Supreme Court, the left has been in open panic.
Liberty Nation with Tim Donner.
Big tech goes under the Klieg lights of Congress and gets hit from all sides. Does this mean big changes ahead for Facebook, Amazon, Google, and the other big tech giants? And how would those changes affect the election now just 3 months away? Welcome back into Liberty Nation Radio, a production of LibertyNation.com and heard from coast to coast on the Radio America Network. We will drill down in a moment on what was said and what might change following a congressional hearing on Wednesday that took the heads of Facebook, Amazon, Google, and Apple to the woodshed. And we'll cover a lot of additional ground. Is Black Lives Matter being taken over by white progressives with an agenda far more expansive than racial justice? And how much do Americans actually know about the self-professed beliefs of Black Lives Matter? Plus, how an entire continent dominated by Marxism and socialism should serve as yet another reminder, as if we needed one, of the nightmare of communism now being unleashed after dark in the great cities of America. We'll be joined by Sarah Cowgill and Andrew Moran of LibertyNation.com, along with legal affairs editor Scott Cosenza for Talkin' Liberty.
Say what? Say what? Say what? One more time.
We kick things off with our signature segment, Say What?, where we roll out a virtual assembly line of wacky, astonishing, damnable, and ultimately revealing things uttered by politicians and the chattering class. For almost 6 hours, the CEOs of Facebook, Amazon, Google, and Apple were grilled from every side, as members of Congress from the left and right expressed outrage at big tech for different reasons, but with the same bottom line. These companies have altogether too much power to monopolize the public conversation, power to shut down competition and silence voices that don't agree with their left-wing corporate cultures. And they do so without fear of consequence or liability. The argument from the right was spearheaded by the man who has become the single most effective and outspoken conservative voice on Capitol Hill, Ohio Congressman Jim Jordan, and it was all about censorship.
I'll just cut to the chase. Big tech's out to get conservatives. That's not a suspicion. That's not a hunch. That's a fact. July 20th, 2020, Google removes the homepages of Breitbart and the Daily Caller. Just last night, we learned Google has censored Breitbart so much traffic has declined 99%. June 16th, 2020, Google threatens to demonetize and ban the Federalist. April 19th, 2020, Google and YouTube announce a policy censoring the content that conflicts with recommendations of the World Health Organization. Now think about that. The World Health Organization, the organization that lied to us, the organization that shilled for China. And if you contradict something they say, they can say whatever they want. They can lie for China. They can shill for China. You say something against them, you get censored.
So conservatives are up in arms about the transparent left-wing, anti-conservative, anti-Trump bias baked into all of these big tech giants. But the left has a different beef, as expressed by Lucy McBath of Georgia and the chair of the congressional subcommittee holding the hearings, David Cicilline of Rhode Island. And it was all about excessive, even monopoly power.
Amazon has nearly 7 times the market share of its closest e-commerce competitor. One seller told us that, and I quote, Amazon continues to be the only show in town. No matter how angry sellers get, they have nowhere else to go. So are you saying that these people aren't being truthful when they say that Amazon is the only game in town?
Many of the practices used by these companies have harmful economic effects. They discourage entrepreneurship, destroy jobs, hike costs, and degrade quality. Simply put, they have too much power. Why does Google steal content from honest businesses?
I disagree with that characterization. Just last week, I met with many small businesses. In fact, today we support 1.4 million small businesses.
We don't bury the competition with monopoly power. We support a lot of small businesses. Is it just me, or doesn't that sound a bit like, I'm not a racist, some of my best friends are black? But the question now is twofold. given that we have this show of shared outrage from both Republicans and Democrats, will anything actually get done? President Trump has threatened executive action, unspecified as of now, if Congress fails to act. The heart of the matter is Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, which shields platforms like Facebook from being held legally responsible for what's posted on their site. Here's exactly how that Section 230 is worded. Quote, "No provider or user of an interactive computer service shall be treated as the publisher or speaker of any information provided by another information content provider," unquote. But if they pick and choose what content they publish, they could then be reclassified as a publisher, subject to the same liability laws, i.e. getting sued, as magazines, newspapers, and online websites. And that is the last thing these big tech giants can afford. But the big tech CEOs weren't the only ones grilled by Congress this week. Attorney General Bill Barr was called on the carpet, compelled to testify on a number of decisions he's made in an attempt by House Judiciary Chairman, the one and only Jerry Nadler, to discredit all his work and accuse him of simply being a flack for President Trump.
In your time at the department, you have aided and abetted the worst failings of the president. In coordination with the White House, the department has spread disinformation about voter fraud, failed to enforce voting rights laws, and attempted to change the census rules to flaunt the plain text of the Constitution, and even defied court orders on this subject, all in the apparent attempt to assist the president's re-election. Yes or no, have you discussed the president's re-election campaign with the president or with any White House official or any surrogate of the president?
Not in relation to this program.
I didn't ask that. I asked if you discussed that with...
I'm a member of the cabinet and there's an election going on. Obviously the topic
So
comes
the answer
up.
is yes.
Well, the topic comes up in cabinet meetings and other things. It shouldn't
And
be a
as part of-
surprise. I'm supposedly punishing the president's enemies and helping his friends. What enemies have I indicted? Who could you point to one indictment that has been under the department that you feel is unmerited?
This an obvious hedge by Democrats against any actions Barr might take in his investigation of spying on the Trump campaign. And Jim Jordan, him again, said it's all quite obvious.
Spying. That one word. That's why they're after you, Mr. Attorney General. They attack you. They've been attacking you every day, every week, for simply stating the truth that the Obama-Biden administration spied on the Trump campaign. 1 year ago, New York Times headline said this: FBI sent investigator posing as assistant to meet with Trump aide in 2016. The FBI sent a young lady who used the name Azra Turk to meet Papadopoulos in September of 2016. They sent someone pretending to be someone else to meet a person associated with the Trump campaign. You know what they call that? Spying. 1 month later, October 2016, they used the dossier to spy on Carter Page. The salacious, unverified dossier, Jim Comey's words, not mine. They took it to the FISA court, didn't tell the courts that the Clintons paid for it, didn't tell the court that the guy who wrote the document, Christopher Steele, had already communicated to the Justice Department that he was, quote, desperate to stop Trump from getting elected.
Whether the real story, the full story of the Obama Justice Department spying on the Trump campaign is ever heard by the American people is decidedly uncertain at this point, because the elite media will do all they can to bury and discredit it and call it old news. But at this point, waiting for Barr to even make a move has been like waiting for Godot. Still no indication as to when he might issue a report or announce indictments. Meanwhile, President Trump, still running behind in public polls, the same polls predicting a smashing victory for Hillary Clinton in 2016, hit the ground running with a crystal clear campaign message in an appearance before a Texas energy group. Not so much about him, but about the forces backing his opponent, Joe Biden.
It's not just Texas oil that the radical Democrats want to destroy. They want to destroy our country. These people are sick. They don't love our country. There's no respect for the American way of life. There is no way of life ever in history that's been like the great American way of life. The radical left wants to tear down everything in its way. They want to uproot and demolish every American value. They want to wipe away every trace of religion from national life. They want to indoctrinate our children, defund our police, abolish the suburbs, incite riots, and leave every city at the mercy of the radical left.
Not much ambiguity there. Full strength Trump. The only question is whether this country has changed so profoundly over the last 4 years that a message like that lacks the power it did in 2016. And only the voters can decide if the threat he so explicitly described there is exaggerated or real. Quick break, and then we're back to discuss how black leaders are reacting to all those white progressives in the middle of all that violence after dark across the land.
Liberty Nation with Tim Donner.
Well, unsurprisingly, the elite media is refusing to show a lot of the violence occurring night after night in cities like Portland and Seattle, not to mention New York, Atlanta, Chicago, and elsewhere. But if you've managed to catch any of the largely censored video of, for example, criminals in Portland laying siege to the federal courthouse there every night for over 2 months, attacking, setting fires, and even using lasers to try and blind police, you'll notice a perplexing sight. Most of these mobs supposedly demanding racial justice appear to be dominated by white people. But is this something welcomed by people of color? In a groundbreaking article this week on LibertyNation.com, Heartland correspondent Sarah Cowgill writes the following about San Francisco, arguably the most famous white progressive city in the nation. Quote, "The city by the bay has its fair share of woke, wealthy white progressives voting for other progressives, which is all good and well, until an attempted coup is made to occupy the Black Lives Matter movement. Those folks are crossing lines, and in a candid moment, San Francisco Mayor London Breed admonished Caucasian allies and proclaimed, 'I have a real problem with the takeover of the movement by white people.' The article is entitled, 'Black Folks Tell White Liberals to Back Off,' and the author, Sarah Cowgill, joins us now. Hello, Ms. Sarah.
Well, hello, Tim. Happy to be here.
It's a pleasure to have you, as always. Now, let me ask you the question you pose in your article about the white progressives desperate to signal their virtue by toppling monuments and attacking and torching federal buildings. If the legitimate racial justice movement doesn't want them, what are the woke folk to do now?
I'm not sure. Pack up, go home, wait for the next cause du jour, and, wait for some kind of whitey movement. I'm not sure.
You used a couple of important quotes in your article, one of them from Anthony Beckford, the president of Black Lives Matter Brooklyn, who stated, "Our fight is our fight. Their privilege can amplify the message, but they can never speak for us. There have been moments where some have wanted to be in the front. I've told them to go to the back of the bus for the white people in this movement." That's what he's saying.
That's exactly what he's saying. And I wouldn't want my movement hijacked either by people who think they can tell the black community how to do it better. I mean, in the 60s, do you ever remember seeing Martin Luther King and John Lewis and all these guys walking arm in arm? Did you ever see white people ahead of them? No, they were in the front. They were always up front and center. And this is not happening with this movement.
Excellent point. Now, another quote that you use going back a ways to the 1960s, which explains the word that was used for black people back then, which I'll say was the acceptable term, the common term for it then. But Malcolm X, who didn't believe in the peaceful protests of Martin Luther King, but believed in being far more aggressive than that, he once proclaimed, I love this quote, "The worst enemy that the Negro have is this white man that runs around here drooling at the mouth, professing to love Negroes and calling himself a liberal. And it is following these white liberals that has perpetuated problems that Negroes have. If the Negro wasn't taken, tricked, or deceived by the white liberal, the Negroes would get together and solve our own problems.
They know that the liberal politicians, all they do is use them. They use them. They're not allowed to do anything. They're not allowed to think. They're forced to vote Democrat every freaking time. You know, having white Hollywood stand up and proclaim, let's defund the police because we have to because of George Floyd, that's not their call. It's the black movement. It's their call. It is not up to Hollywood whiteys.
Now, the reverse angle is that this insurrection could not continue almost unabated if it weren't for the thousands of white people in the center of it. So where do you think this whole post-George Floyd insurrection would be if it was limited only to black people?
Same place Ferguson was. How many years ago was that? It died out. It died out rather quickly. And 5 years from now, I'm not sure George Floyd is going to be a household name either. Social networking is incredibly powerful for pop-up riots and pop-up protesting. So I think had Ferguson happened last week, we would have had the same thing.
Well, the Washington Redskins recently got rid of their name after 88 years as a bow to who? Native Americans don't care except for a small number of radical activists. It doesn't help black people. Does nothing for victims of police violence. And now the team owner can't even decide on a new name for the former Redskins. How are regular workaday Americans in your neck of the woods out in the heartland taking in all of these empty gestures?
Turning off the TV. That people are just they don't care anymore.
All right, Sarah, you and I will take on the assignment of coming up with a new acceptable nickname for the Redskins. It'll take about 5 years, but we'll get there.
We'll get there. I'm excited about this. This will be fun.
Thank you, Sarah.
You're welcome.
Sarah Cowgill, LibertyNation.com. Quick break, and then we'll discuss the disastrous consequences to an entire continent overtaken by the professed ideology of the movers and shakers of the insurrection taking place in cities across the land, Marxism.
Ready, set, go!
Stay ahead of the curve with LibertyNation.com, because we put the power of the press in your hands. With one click, Liberty Nation delivers tomorrow's news.
And remember, liberty.
Today.
All the time and everywhere.
Liberty Nation connected the dots between a Chinese research biolab and a wet market where COVID-19 was supposedly discovered 2 months before the MSM. We were first to alert you of a serious attack on gun rights in Virginia. LN honed in on the Biden-Burisma scandal months before it hit the papers. We brought you exclusive interviews from the border.
We're looking at people just rising up.
Liberty Nation was on the ground in London.
Trump rally in front of the American embassy.
Bringing you on-the-scene reports about Brexit. LN reported that COVID-19 was more virulent but less deadly weeks before others. LibertyNation.com delivers tomorrow's news today with LNTV's Liberty Nation Radio, The Uprising and Rabbit Hole podcasts, and dozens of insightful original articles and a new Roku channel. Stay ahead of the curve with LibertyNation.com and get tomorrow's news today. LibertyNation.com.
Liberty Nation with Tim Donner.
As the openly Marxist Black Lives Matter continues to push the envelope in city after city, undergirded by Democrat mayors and governors who've refused to stop weeks on end of violence, destruction, and outright insurrection in Portland, Seattle, and several other cities, there exists a gulf as wide as an ocean between what young people in particular believe about Marxism, if they've even bothered to consider it, and the reality on the ground. A brief look at history demonstrates the unrelenting misery and death spiral of every single nation that's been overtaken by this communist philosophy over the last 103 years since the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia. The world has recoiled in horror upon learning about the death march of totalitarians like Mao Zedong in China, Pol Pot in Cambodia, Robert Mugabe in Zimbabwe. Anyone with even a shred of intellectual honesty can reach only one conclusion. Marxism, communism has been a plague on the planet Earth far worse than any pandemic or even a nuclear bomb. But one of the most vivid, broad-ranging, and overlooked examples is an entire continent dominated by socialism. That would be Africa, where socialism replaced European colonialism steadily over the last 75 years or so. What can we learn from Africa about socialism? A lot, according to Andrew Moran, author of an article on LibertyNation.com entitled "Socialism, Not Colonialism, Keeps Africa in Perpetual Poverty." And Andrew joins us now. Hello, Andrew.
Hello, thank you for having me.
Always a pleasure. Let me ask you a question that you yourself pose in the first paragraph of your article. Following decades of destitution, deprivation, and despair, has Africa learned from socialism's failure?
Well, I'll quote the great economist Milton Friedman, who said, "Governments never learn, only people do." I think a lot of Africans, I don't have the polling data to back this up, maybe Pew has done this, but I think a lot of Africans understand the failure of their governments and their corruption and ineptitude and generations of poverty. A lot of Africans are trying to be self-reliant, and you see the growing entrepreneurial spirit occurring across the continent. They're trying to serve their communities with goods and services using access to technology, mobile devices, mobile internet, things like that. But the problem, unfortunately, is that the government clamps down on these successes, and they always reinforce their iron fist. And they get shakedowns, or they impose government restrictions. They demand bribes. If you look at Zimbabwe right now, people they're having again food shortages and blackouts, and all this is 2 years after Mugabe conceded power. And so people are forced to sell basic necessities in the back of their cars at nighttime in the middle of nowhere out of fear of retribution from the state, especially if you're a white person. So no, I don't think African politicians have learned from socialism's failure. I think in an attempt to misdirect the public, they'll blame the white people for their problems, which is currently what's going on in South Africa right now. And the strategy appears to be working so far. So I guess in order for these dictators to stay in power, they'll just blame, the white minority in their countries to say, it's not our fault we're suffering. It's the white man's fault.
Well, on that note, critics will say the continent of Africa was decimated and demoralized by the colonial rule of European powers, England, France, Germany, others. And that's the real cause of Africa's seemingly unending despair. Tell us what's wrong with that argument.
Well, I think history is complicated. It's not as black and white as saying that British colonialism of Africa was horrific. I think everyone can agree that colonization is not a desirable system. You don't want an invading force to occupy your land. But that said, British colonists, they helped develop many of these places in sub-Saharan Africa. The British introduced a lot of positive things, sanitation, primary healthcare, business development, public transportation, a lot of infrastructure. So they introduced a lot of things that few Africans had access to. Research has found that the average African today is poorer than at the height of colonialism. The building blocks of capitalism were also integral to African development of that period, from respecting private property rights to maintaining contractual relationships. There's actually the former president of Sierra Leone met with a visiting British politician, and there were these bunch of reporters surrounding their meeting, and he asked if Sierra Leone can again become a part of the British Empire. So that's just so show that many people, even within Africa, think that they were better off being a subject to the Great Britain than being independent in dealing with these horrific dictators. Before colonialism, many of the parts of the continent were difficult to navigate. You had a lot of tribal warfare and slavery. And, the conditions were not great. It wasn't until British colonies introduced advanced technologies that these places could utilize their vast amount of untapped potential, whether it's from commodities or farmland. So during the days, let's say Rhodesia, during the British colony, Zimbabwe was the breadbasket of Africa. It provided the continent and the rest of the world with a lot of agricultural goods, wheat, grain, all that stuff. Today, it imports nearly all of its food. For the remainder of what it produces, it has to, during when Mugabe was president, he imposed legislation that would force white-owned farms to transport or to transfer ownership to black people. The problem with that policy is that when the black people when a lot of these blacks took control of the white land, they didn't know what they were doing. They were inexperienced. They didn't know how to grow, how to cultivate land, all that stuff. So another issue too is that when they didn't know what they were doing, they gave up the land. They just abandoned it. So we had this good land with all this with great potential. Now nobody's running it. Therefore, the country is running out of food, and they have to turn to outside sources for that. Everywhere you go across Africa throughout since the post-colonial era, Tanzania, Zimbabwe, Ethiopia, South Sudan, they adopt a lot of these villagization policies, and they're out of food. Their remedies. And what I find funny too is that when they adopt these socialist policies, it was out of the name of remedying the food crisis. Now there were food problems, but what happened? They exacerbated the problem. They made it a whole lot worse.
Well, now some of these African countries, are not only fertile, but they're rich in natural resources like oil and gold, and yet they're still impoverished. I'll ask the same thing I have about oil-rich Venezuela, which has become a frightening hellhole. How is it possible for countries like this to have starving people and runaway hyperinflation when they have so many commodities that are valuable and easily sold to the rest of the world?
Well, of course. I mean, the answer to that question is socialism. Sure, fine. The British don't occupy Africa anymore, and Venezuela has been independent for, I think, a century. Now, when it comes to Venezuela, the situation, I think, is a bit more complicated. But I think the overall issue with the oil situation in Caracas is price controls and a shortage of materials and equipment to extract and ship the oil. Now, when before the sector was nationalized by the government, they were able to export huge amounts of oil. Everything became nationalized under Maduro. Now, what happened there? When everything was nationalized under Maduro and the borders were, it was hard to deal with Venezuela because of the sanctions. They didn't have access to tools. They didn't have access to a lot of the goods and services you needed to take that oil out. So, but by the end of it all, when government's running the oil, they didn't know what they didn't know what they were doing. Anytime the government has attempted to resolve any issue or benefit from something, they failed.
Now, you write, the socialists claim you can't have capitalism without racism, and that is what's kept socialism largely ever present throughout most of Africa. Explain that, if you would, that you can't have capitalism without racism.
Yeah, well, I've seen this a long time, and when I was covering the Occupy Wall Street protests years ago, they had the same kind of idea. Capitalism is racist, and capitalism is exploitative, and all that hot garbage. But this explains why they don't want to engage in debate or discussion, because they know that if these platitudes were even just dissected for a few moments, everything would fall apart. They know that their concepts don't amount much to anything. Capitalism only cares about one color, green. But if capitalism were racist, as I wrote in my article, how come Nigerians who come to the United States have an median income higher than the national average in the United States? Why do Asians flourish in every country that they migrate to in any market-oriented economy? So it doesn't make sense when they say that capitalism is a racist institution, because so many ethnicities, so many minorities have benefited from the system. And one thing I detest is when I read that socialism and Africa go hand in hand because of this whole brother's keeper idea. It's ridiculous, because then how come they're not benefiting? How come they're not being successful? How come when Africans move to the United States, Canada, Europe, they flourish? So socialism is not compatible with African culture whatsoever, from what I've studied. Well, maybe need a Black Lives Matter person to prove me wrong.
Well, as always, you've taken us to school, Andrew, and we thank you for that. Information is key, and everybody needs to know what Marxism, socialism is really about. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Andrew Moran, LibertyNation.com. Quick break, and then we're back with Talkin' Liberty.
Liberty Nation with Tim Donner.
And now we have reached the portion of Liberty Nation Radio which we wait the whole show for it, let's be honest. It's called Talkin' Liberty. It is self-explanatory, and it's the time when we reintroduce our regular contributor, constitutional lawyer, LibertyNation.com legal affairs editor, and the man we sort of taken a fancy to calling our guardian of individual liberty, Scott David Cosenza. Hello, Scott.
Well, hello, Tim. Thank you so much.
You're welcome, and I'm going to set you on course by simply stating one word and letting you take it from there. Portland.
That is...
and all it invokes.
And all it invokes. It looks like things are headed towards some calm. If the protesters that have been particularly animated with violence against federal property and authorities will be less so when Oregon state troopers are in control of the situation. The incidence of the federal government arresting people is going to play out in the weeks and months to come. I suspect we'll have some suits against the federal government alleging arrest and detainment without probable cause, but then there will also be many, Tim, criminal trials of people who are charged with federal crimes for the violence and havoc they reaped in the city. So a lot to chew on there.
Well, of course, there would be a lot more criminals on trial if these cities actually cracked down on these people and stopped the 60-day plus
I think you're dead wrong about that, Tim.
Siege of the federal
courthouse. If they cracked
courthouse.
down on it, then day one there would have been a few, and then that would have been the stop to it. The only reason why it went on for 60 days.
60-day siege.
And let's recall that that's where these federal troops have been dispatched, which are the focus of so much hate, but they were only sent there because of the complete and utter lack of state and local police support for a federal courthouse.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I mean, who is supposed to protect federal property? First, it should be the mayor or the governor, but since both of them have refused in the state of Oregon, it's got to be the federal government,
Tim,
or the federal courthouse burns to the ground.
For 2 months, the people of Portland were suffering from the nightly public commission of felonies without recourse from the state and the local government. I can only imagine that's going to reverberate for some time to come in that city and state.
Well, Miami police are setting up mask traps. Another COVID-related story. $100 fines. Not to people not wearing masks, Scott, but to people who are wearing them improperly.
Tim, we talk often about, I just go right back to the Eric Garner story where we've talked about, the reason why that man is dead is because it's illegal to sell a cigarette in the manner in which he was accused of doing so. Whether he did it or not, that was the entree for the police into his life. And anytime the authorities pass a new law with a sanction, it invites police officers or regulatory officers into people's lives and creates the situation where it can spiral out of control. I would hope that would be part of what reforms would be like in a post-Black Lives Matter, post-George Floyd world. But here's what we're seeing. This is not somebody who says, hey, I'm not going to wear a mask. You can, go tell it to the whatever. No, this is a person who is taking a sip of a drink or putting their mask down for a second and or inappropriately wearing it, and the government will use all of its tools to get money and arrests because the people who conduct these arrests or write the fine tickets, they get rewarded for that behavior.
Right,
and
right.
so they're incentivizing. Yes, exactly.
Well, do we have a sense of how many of these $100 fines have been issued? I mean, we're talking about a couple, a dozen, several hundred?
Well, NBC Miami reported that the Miami-Dade police were conducting 500 random compliance checks each day to enforce the county's public health ordinance. So.
Okay, well, they're trying. They're trying to collect that revenue, Scott. They're doing the best they can using COVID as the pretext in this case. So let's go on to another COVID story. This one from Ohio. This could have a change in public perception, Scott, because hydroxychloroquine as a treatment for COVID-19 has become almost entirely a political football. You'd think that a treatment that could help people not to die or get serious, serious symptoms from COVID, anything that would help them, you'd think that people would encourage that.
Not
but
if it
instead,
makes Donald Trump look good.
Exactly.
Tim. How dare you?
And the minute he started,
they're trying to win an election here, Tim.
Exactly.
I mean, you got to break a few eggs.
Well,
you know.
and of course, the moment he came out and said that it was good, and then said he had taken it, that it couldn't be good, and so it's been viewed and demonized in the press as something that's some kind of a...
Trump seems to be one of the few who was able to escape one of the horrible adverse effects of
That's
hydroxychloroquine that we keep reading about.
He was just lucky, Scott, just lucky. Probably the Russians. They
I
got
think
him
that,
into office.
so
but in Ohio...
the State Board of Pharmacy said it would ban doctors from prescribing hydroxychloroquine for COVID-19 until Governor DeWine, I guess, rang them up on the phone and let them know that, they were going to come at him with pitchforks in a second there and quickly reversed course. The sad thing, Tim, is there was no new study that was published that the Board of Pharmacy based their decision on or medical information. As you say, this is a political story, and that is why they did it, and that's why they reversed it. My guess is, Tim, that it was just initiated on a political basis and then quickly reversed on a political basis for the same but mirror reasons.
All right, fair enough. 3 months till the election, Scott. It's all
and
about
it's
the
going to
election.
be either much worse or much better.
Correct. Yeah, it's not going to be the same. We know that. Finally, Scott, we're gonna finish up in your favorite city in the world, the cradle of liberty, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, where 16 cops who were disciplined for racist, offensive Facebook posts are suing, saying they were victims of discrimination.
Well, that's right, Tim. There was this big open record sort of, I think they call it the Plainview Project, where these groups would monitor Facebook posts from people they identified as police officers and compile a kind of record of their posts, and then comb through that for posts that could be deemed discriminatory, racist, or otherwise offensive.
Or conservative.
For sure.
Yeah.
And then target those people for removal. And in the largest mass firing in Philadelphia police history, they fired a whole bunch of them. Now, two groups of those cops have sued, and I think it's a fascinating question of, if you've posted a meme on Facebook, are you endorsing that? Is that your speech? Or are you, for what purpose are you posting it? And also, the way that the security controls on the account are set, were they done intentionally open or perhaps not? All those things. So these officers who were fired, kind of summarily dismissed for some of these posts, right? They without due process to determine even if they themselves made the posts, meaning it could have been people share accounts with their spouses in some instances and that sort of thing. So I think it's going to be interesting. And really, it's one of these things where by failure to kind of move deliberately and react to a kind of lash out, I think that sadly the people of Philadelphia are going to have to take it on the chin again, because what's going to happen is a lot of these cops are going to be reinstated with back pay. They're going to have to pay for attorney's fees, and some of them probably who were actually racist, and they won't have been able to be fired legitimately, right? And so, and then of course the ones who who were fired and are not racist and shouldn't have been fired, they're kind of in a bad position as well going forward. So. Not a great situation there.
Complicated times, Scott.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Thank you.
This program, Liberty Nation Radio and LibertyNation.com's own podcasts, The Uprising, hosted by Scott, and The Rabbit Hole, Politics and Prose with our own Mark Angelides, all available on demand at LibertyNation.com and from fine podcast providers everywhere. So that is it for this week, but we'll be back at you next week. Same time, same station. Till then, this is Tim Donner saying, now more than ever, stand up for liberty. And we'll see you next time on Liberty Nation Radio.